Welcome, everyone. Nice to have you back, and those of you who are new, welcome. So my name is Aryan Zara. I'm the assistant curator at NIMWA. My colleague Ginny Trainer, the associate curator, and I are the co-curators of Paper Roots Women to Watch 2020. Today we're sitting down with another exceptional Women to Watch artist, Elizabeth Alexander, who represents our Massachusetts committee. Paper Roots is our sixth and largest Women to Watch exhibition to be held at NIMWA since we began this exhibition series in 2008. It features 22 incredibly talented artists. For those of you who may be new, this is a collaboration with our national and international outreach committees, as well as regional curators who help us select artists working in a particular theme or genre. Our Massachusetts committee has been an integral part of our Women to Watch series, as well as the mission of the museum from the very beginning. So first of all, I wanted to start off by thanking Sarah Trico, of course, Hadley Powell, Sharon Lewis, and the rest of the Massachusetts committee for all your support for NIMWA over the years. And I also wanted to thank Lisa Tung, who's the executive director of the Mass Art Museum in Boston, for serving as consulting curator and for introducing us to the work of Elizabeth Alexander. So Paper Roots is an exhibition about artists doing something differently and creatively with the medium of paper. Elizabeth is an interdisciplinary artist who creates these, what I find, whimsical and fantastical sculptures and installations out of paper and found objects. And she takes concepts of domesticity and the decorative and the concepts of the feminine and what is considered superficial and beauty and all of these ideals and re-examines them in a really powerful and poignant way. A little bit more about Elizabeth. She was awarded the title Best Artist of Boston for 2014 by Improper Bostonian magazine. She has been highlighted by publications including Hyperallergic, Boston Magazine, and the Boston Globe. She has served as a guest speaker, juror, and critic at various institutions, including the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and she currently lives and works in North Carolina, where she teaches sculpture at the University of North Carolina's School of Design and Production. So great to have you here, Liz, and with that very brief intro, I will hand it off to you now.
All right, thank you so much for all the things that you just said. I'm so honored to represent Massachusetts and then also be a part of the show and this lecture series, which has been a wonderful way to stay engaged and learn more about all of the artists that I'll be showing with. You don't usually get to know so much about the artists that you are in an exhibition with typically. So it's been wonderful when I've been able to see everyone else's perspective and the way they use paper and the way they think about their work. And so I'm going to share my screen. I want to talk a little bit about the body of work that kind of led me to the work that will be in Paper Roots, and some of the themes that I examine, which are part of what I do. So I have quite a large body of work, and it goes off in many different directions, but domesticity and these sort of visual absences and presence are kind of throughout the work always. My work is very heavily influenced by my surroundings and events in my life and current events and kind of how they function within the home or come back into the home. I consider the delicacy of home and as a common projection of our ideal self, also as a marker of status, as a marker of values, and as a place of safety and comfort to be a sort of precarious ideal. I think a lot about how home as a concept or symbol contradicts what it means to be a place that houses people, human beings, flawed human beings living in a private space. And, you know, a space that kind of bears witness to our darkest and brightest moments. So this is a series that I created at the Cranbrook Academy of Art when I was a student in 2008 during the last recession. And so I was sort of like looking, you know, when you're in graduate school, you're planning your life, and all of these, you know, thoughts of comfort and just the ability to sort of plan anything concrete was a fairly frail idea and fairly precarious. And so I was thinking a lot about that when I was making this piece. So I am the figure in this photo series, and I am sort of obsessively contriving this living space, this sort of comfortable living space, and then only to take it apart piece by piece, flower by flower, and then kind of reassemble it back into this kind of carpet on the floor. And so I think of this as a narrative series of 3 parts, and then I kind of see it continuing after the 3rd panel into you know, questions of whether I'm going to continue repairing the space, or will I continue to deconstruct what I just did and sort of wind up in this cycle of kind of just trying to manage just what I could control. So I consider it a very disrupted space and kind of unsettled. And I've revisited this series several times. I call it Keeping Up Appearances, kind of a nod to that BBC comedy, but also sort of idea of maintaining a kind of veneer of poise and kind of not addressing what's actually going on in your life, but to sort of have this like posturing a bit. So like I said, I've revisited this series several times, but in the new iterations, you can actually enter the space and witness it in person. And I'm taking apart wallpaper and then creating objects only out of the paper for the new series, versus in the photographs where I had objects in there with everything else. And my husband created a soundtrack for the works where he was actually recording my labor taking apart all of this wallpaper. So it has this like dragging sound that echoes through the space, and he layered it with a lullaby. So there's this kind of tension and release that you can hear as you're looking at the work. This is a different piece also created for photographs. So sometimes I create installations to be entered. Sometimes I create them for photographs. Sometimes I create just singular objects or wall hangings. But this piece, I just asked a simple question: what would a space look like if I took all the pattern out and didn't put it back in? So this image was once a very mismatched, kind of garish combination of different patterns, and then by removing them all, I kind of leveled the playing field, and it became almost like this blanket of sameness. And there's this, you can sort of like, things are kind of coming in and receding into each other. And so the elements, the wallpaper, the chair, the rug, are kind of both absent and present in the same space. And I also consider this piece as a sort of visualization of the static or staleness that is evident in a space that has depression. So, and I consider a lot about my own life and people I care about, who I've lived with or care a lot about, who manage life with mental illness or chronic pain or both, and how that influences the comfort of private space, and how it might disrupt that or affect it. So this is Crumbs Under My Pillow. This piece was created on the heels of my own wedding, and I wanted to instead of creating an intimate living space, I wanted it to be more open and grand. I had a 30-foot wall to sort of activate. And so I opened up the space instead of trying to force an expansive space to feel more intimate. And it's again, this sort of deconstructed wallpaper and a deconstructed chair with these objects in front of it that are all cast paper. And I was thinking a lot about marriage and sort of what it really felt to me versus what I was sort of raised or what culture was sort of telling me that marriage was supposed to be. I grew up working class, and so it was like, you know, girls are sort of taught as they're growing up that their value begins at marriage. And so you're sort of just like waiting for this time that your life begins. And I questioned that a lot, and I just wanted to know like what happens if you're maybe choosing things slightly differently or going about like being a bride and marriage in a different way, and not having it be this sort of like answer to maybe things about your life, like choosing a impractical path like visual arts. So the objects that I chose to cast for this piece are, and it kind of encrust in the florals that I removed from the wallpaper, are objects of nostalgia. So there's these sort of like pile of teacups, there's a gramophone horn, there's bits of furniture, and they kind of come in and out of focus as you're looking because of all of the pattern all over everything. It sort of does something funny to the form and the volume of an object. And then you can see evidence of a performance that I'll talk about in a second behind around the chair. So Crumbs Under My Pillow is a reference to a ritual from the 17th century where a single woman attending a wedding would be given a piece of the wedding cake to take home and put under her pillow. So she would dream about her future husband and sort of meditate on promises of a better future. And it's actually the origins of wedding favors. But I thought that was a perfect metaphor for this kind of absurdity that I was grappling with, while also being really excited about the ritual of professing, you know, my love and forming a lifelong bond with someone. So I had a performance event where, in the Keeping Up Appearances photo series, I was the performer in the photographs. But when I do them live, I collaborate with people that are a little more experienced with performance and were using their body. And so for the performance event, a figure sat atop this high chair out of reach of all the contents on the table. And she was shrouded with all the flowers removed from her dress, kind of keeping her inaccessible also from any passersby during the event. It was sort of, there were people all around while this was happening. And during the event, she was plucking the petals out of a bouquet of flowers and dropping them on the floor in this kind of ritual of forward looking. And you really didn't see her very clearly until she started moving, which I really love to watch my work activated and almost seen through somebody else's eyes as they're performing within it. This is a cage no less, and for this piece I began cutting wallpaper during the past election and the Me Too movement, and it was just like this inundation of all of this news happening, and it was bringing up a lot of kind of forgotten trauma. And so I decided to create a sort of screen protector for the assemblage, which is behind this. But it's a flawed screen because it's full of holes from extracting all the print. And on one side I put Tyvek home wrap, and then on the other side I put the wallpaper, so it had this exterior interior quality to it. And then it is sort of guarding this assemblage of objects that all have an association with sound. So the angular piece is a cast paper piano harp, and these are two gramophone horns, and then these are piano keys and sort of teetering on this precarious leg. I like to play a lot with balance and expectations of how forms, weight distribution would be, because paper is so light, you can kind of defy what you understand of physics a little bit. But the reason I used all of these noise making elements was because I felt at that time so frustrated and so helpless. I felt like I was screaming from the corner all the time. And so I wanted to sort of embody that in the work. And as you were in the space, you actually could hear a sound collage that Todd Bowser, my husband, made, where he was taking all the strings. He recorded all the strings being removed from the piano harp before I cast it. And you're hearing the destruction of the piece of the thing that you're looking at while you're in the space. So it kind of further created this sense of imbalance. And I don't always know when I concentrate the print, I don't always know how it's going to read in a new way, because if you study color theory, it's all about sort of relationships. And so I didn't expect it to dull down as much as it did in this piece. But I felt like it sort of almost looks like it's dying a little bit as it gets to the horns, like it's like drying up like dried leaves or something. So I wanted to talk a little bit about process. I feel like it sounds so much more complicated before I show images of what I do, this sort of like extracting print and kind of separating the parts, but I'm literally taking rolls of wallpaper and cutting out all of the contents and sort of then separating them by color and separating it all. So I usually have all of the negative space on one element, so you get the sense of loss, and then all of the positives, all the florals concentrated, so it's like almost like this really saccharine, abundant, like it's like a little more chaotic, and it does things to blend all the objects together as well. So when I have all the negative space, I then reapply it, like kind of collage it back together on different surfaces, Tyvek, as you saw in one of the images, or mat board or something else, just as a backer. And then I cut that out again. So all the spaces between, that's my least favorite part of the process. I enjoy cutting everything out the first time, and I don't enjoy it the second time, but I like the effects, so I do it. And then then you get these sort of like very delicate skins of this wallpaper that's like sort of full of voids and sense of loss. And then with the other work, with the other stuff, so I still have all the flowers, and anytime I cut anything apart, I always save all the components. I always use them either as a part and counterpart or in their own pieces. This is my upgraded studio situation, so I can actually work on a vertical surface, and I can just keep rolling the wallpaper down as I'm cutting it out. Then I concentrate all of that pattern together, and I don't really plan all that much how it's going to come together until I'm actually doing it. So it's the way I work with color and the way I work with the collaging is improvised. But I plan the forms, and I plan obviously the wallpaper when I'm picking out and putting all of my materials together. That's all planned. But then I like to have an element where you sort of can see my thought process in the work while you're looking at it. So, and the way that I cast the objects is something called laminate casting, where I'm literally taking sheets of paper. Sometimes I create the sheets myself, and I collaborate with a woman that makes certain pulp combinations for me. And I just layer them one on top of the other using a glue called methyl cellulose, and then I slice it out with a razor. in order to put it back together as a hollow form and create a duplicate. So this is a completely hollow version of this branch. So I can then play a lot more with weight. I think I started doing this because it was cheaper to ship a paper chair than a regular chair, a wooden chair. And so it started out very practical, but then evolved into something. I actually really fell in love with the process and have been refining it over time. And then those elements are brought back together in these assemblages. So this is actually the first version of the piece that's going into paper route. So this was created for an installation. And this iteration, I refer to it as 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4. And it was kind of about like waiting and wishing and biding your time. And it was created for the Turchin Center, which is a massive space. So the space I install in often influences my work quite a bit. And I wanted to kind of create a space within the space to play with light, but also kind of make a more contained environment or more intimate space within this massive gallery that's like the size and shape of a baseball diamond. It's a really bizarre space to work with. And the thing that I loved the most about it was that you access it first from a balcony. So you see the work from above before you even go down, you can enter the gallery. So I wanted the piece to change as you sort of went downstairs to enter the space. And so you sort of got to see all the color and all of this sort of like encrusted pattern underneath that I refer to as a chandelier, but the hanging sculpture. And by the time I started working on this piece, the part of the South where I live was either on fire or underwater due to several weather events that happen every year here. And you know, the existential corrosion that I was sort of processing about the world and a lot of my works was sort of literally at my doorstep in the form of all of this environmental carnage. And so I was actually dragging debris from the storm from the park back to my house and collecting it from other areas I was visiting, and then combining it with these domestic objects that were all sort of like about leisure, sort of like lighting and seating and sort of different elements to create this almost like tornado or fallen tree effect. And I felt like when I was applying all the wallpaper print, I was like bedazzling the debris a little bit. You know, it's like almost like creating this like skin of like saccharine, perfect okayness, like over this chaos. And, but I cut back into it so you can see the core of the thing is actually the same as the stuff on the top that was, you know, all of this like almost like charred or rotten looking material. And I chose a paper called Lokta paper, which has that like very luscious sheen to it to create that effect, that almost kind of rotted out looking effect. And I didn't realize when I ordered the paper that some of it has glitter in it. I didn't know that glitter wallpaper existed, so that was an extra exciting thing. So if you see it in person, you can see that happening, the sparkle. But also, I think in order to kind of get the subtlety of the kind of hollow elements, I really hope that this will be able to be seen in person. And I had another performance event with this work where my husband, Todd, played a live version of a sound collage that was actually emanating from this platform, which I refer to as a well, and had a mirror at the bottom. And people that were visiting the space were told that they could cast wishes into the well. And I had performers who I also dressed very similar to the previous performance in Crumbs Under My Pillow. I took all of the flowers out of these bridal robes and put them on headpieces that covered their faces and heads. And so they were responding both to the space and the music and then the actions of the visitors. And I think also actually their their outfits. They were kind of moving in a way that moved the head pieces around. For 2 hours they performed, which was pretty remarkable. And I initially imagined it to be this ambient movement in this space while other people were kind of walking around and taking it in, but they were so engaging that nobody wanted to be in this space. So people would kind of come up, toss a wish in the well really fast, and then go back up to the balcony and watch the performance. But it was like, again, seeing the work interpreted through somebody else's eyes is so magical, and something I hope I can continue doing eventually, because I know live performance is really a tough thing to do right now. And so the piece, like I said, the piece is kind of adapted now for the Museum of the Women in the Arts, and so it's going to feel a lot different. It's not a hanging piece; it's actually a wall piece, and it's a sort of 2-part wall piece. And I wanted to show another kind of version of how I did that with retired elements of an installation. So this is all the parts of Keeping Up Appearances that I turned into its own assemblage and titled Let Him Speak First. And the new title for the piece in Paper Roots is All Things Bright and Beautiful. But I'd like to change the title, because I feel like once you change the way you look at it, it is a totally different thing. And it's its own thing, and it's no less or more special than the previous version. But the way that I created that other piece for the Turchin Center, it didn't seem right to show it exactly the same way anywhere else. It was made specifically for that space. So Let Him Speak First is a 2-part wall hanging. This is, I think, the most closely resembles what All Things Bright and Beautiful would be. And I want to keep it a surprise, so I'm deliberately not showing photos of it. But it's speaking a little bit more, it's a more abstracted living space, and it's kind of just these kind of items of desires, rug, carpet, and chandeliers, and rosettes. There is another Jello mold. There's a lot of Jello molds in my work because they're fun to cast. But it speaks a lot to the sort of unseen dynamics in a living space that leave residue in the space, even if you're not completely aware. It's just like thing in the air that you sense. And the title is a phrase pulled from a vintage advice book for new wives, pointing to the domestic hierarchy that I see still informing a lot of our power dynamics now, even though we sometimes don't admit that that's the case. And him not necessarily being anyone in particular, but a present more important than oneself. And then I wanted to finish with this piece, which I made in the quarantine, where I needed to make a piece for a deadline, but I didn't want to go anywhere. I couldn't really go anywhere. So I was actually kind of gathering what I had around my house, and I chose the scraps from the only wallpaper I've chosen for my house ever in 10 years of working with wallpaper. And I didn't realize when you wallpaper a space how much like left over there is, especially when the print's not repeated that often. There's a lot of scrap. So I just started cutting up these materials, and I've kind of been working on a new series where I put all of the positives and negatives in the same piece instead of separating them into all these other parts. And working directly on mat board and then cutting out the mat board around it and then mounting it to a piece of wood. But I realized that, like, after I'd been working on this, I realized that I was unknowingly kind of enacting Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, like, kind of like managing all of this chaos that's happening in the world through taking apart my own wallpaper in order to do it. But I always really, I don't know, I think this is one of those pieces that's particularly special to me now because of that. And it was more of a struggle to make than I thought it would be. But that directly relates to the thing behind me, the piece that I'm sitting in front of, which is also, I'm afraid to move my computer too much, so, but it's another one of those pieces that has the positives and negatives all in one object. And you can see in the corner, I actually have the wallpaper intact, and then it starts to break down as you move across the panels. And you can sort of see the 3D elements in it. There's a candlestick and parts of a chair, and there's a lighting fixture behind me, but it all kind of blends in if you're not seeing it in person. So a lot of this is improvised. I know I'm breaking apart this wallpaper. I know what the forms are going to be. It's on 2 panels, so they're each 40 by 60 panels, so I know the rough size, but how it all comes together is organic. And, you know, starting out with the intact wallpaper really informed how I chose to proceed. And then it kind of breaks down and becomes almost like foliage over here with the negative space. And I haven't really been able to sort of allow the wallpaper to curl the way that I was working before, and I really like that effect. So I think that's everything I had to say. But I have another show and tell piece. So this is the cinder block that is going to the Women's Museum with the piece. And but you can see, like, I'm strong, but I'm not I'm not that strong. So it's actually really amazing how easily you can kind of construct things and defy gravity and work with your expectations of weight and mass with something like paper, which has sort of subverts that quite a lot. But I don't know if you have any questions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Liz. We have a lot of questions coming in, but yeah, as I'm hearing you speak, you really get the sense of the versatility of paper. And as I hear different artists speak, you never think that paper can be really heavy. You know, you always think of it as really light, but the kind of mass and density that paper can provide is always so surprising with how artists treat that medium. So I do have several questions coming in. I'm just going to start off with one of my questions that combines a couple of other some of our viewers' questions. So I mentioned that in your bio that your works are really, or I find them really whimsical and fantastical. And I look at them, it seems like I'm entering a fantasy space. And you talk about how you activate the space with your works. I find them really vibrant and sort of pulsating with energy. And yet, of course, there's a more serious undertone where you're examining gender roles, social class, American dream, what that might mean in reality. So how do you reconcile the two elements? So how does this really beautiful, bright, dreamlike world work with the darker subjects that you're examining and probing?
I mean, I think a lot about fantasy in terms of this desire for things to be perfect, and then what is perfect. So I'm questioning all of that at once. But I also think, you know, even with experiencing an event or experiencing something in your life or emotions, it's not all one or the other thing. You know, my work talks a lot about these sort of unseen elements of domestic space, but I don't necessarily address it verbally, but I think you can see it in the work. There's also a lot of love in there, and there's a lot of love in those spaces as well. So I try to have those two things coexisting, but show that it doesn't really function exactly how we're told it should. You know, I think everyone's space is different, but private space is full of flawed people. So, or flawed person, you know, but it's kind of the comfort that we're told that it's supposed to always have is fairly precarious. So I like to maintain that precariousness, but also, and I think it's also just the way my brain works, a lot of daydreaming. And, you know, I even think the way I work is very similar to the way I garden. You know, it's like I'm just sort of, I don't do a lot of weeding. Everything that shows up usually stays. But so it's kind of a lot of everything, you know, critique and love and hope and fantasy.
So that actually brings me to this sort of overall question of how you conceptualize your works. As you're talking about several works that have different sources of inspiration. So one of the questions is, what do you look to when you start to create these works of art?
Sometimes I start with an object. So either like Keeping Up Appearances, that photo series started with a chair. I just, that green chair in there, I just started seeing what it would look like with the pattern cut out, and then eventually it just opened up into the space. And the process I do is so labor intensive. I'm often listening to books or listening to music, listening to the news, and those things kind of just filter through me into the work. So a lot of just what I'm experiencing is in there because I'm living so much with the stuff that I'm manipulating for so long. And so often what I'm thinking about at that time is sort of just what the work becomes. You know, I think this stasis in the work is that it has a lot to do with domestic space, but in terms of the rest of the stuff, a lot of the inspiration is kind of just what's around me and what I'm taking in at the time that I'm working.
So then do you start off with like an object that you have found, and then kind of make something from that? Or do you have an idea of what you want to make and you kind of seek out certain wallpaper patterns or certain objects based on that idea that you have?
It kind of goes back and forth. So sometimes it starts out with just an object and I build based on that object. Sometimes the object will dictate a color scheme that I'm looking for. I do collect a lot of things. I tend to like very specific shapes. I like a lot of round, like shapes, like these sort of like table legs and lamps, and you know, these shapes that have a lot of form to them but are often symmetrical and round. So some of it's just like things that I'm drawn to, and then some of it is specific for what I want it to be. So when I was doing the Turchin Center, I knew exactly that I wanted the work to look kind of rotten from the top and then become more magic-like underneath. And I knew I wanted to sort of set up a partition in the room. And then like I might have different criteria that I want to hit, and then that starts to help me plan. But I've noticed when I plan too much, the work feels really static. It doesn't, I need that fluidity in there and the sort of call and response as I'm working, for it to sort of still feel a lot like it's kind of alive. Otherwise, you can tell when I'm like over planning and overthinking what I'm doing. It's very evident. I'm not able to over plan. You know, you kind of need to know how you think and how you work in order for it to function correctly. And that's,
Yeah, and you still want your process to be somewhat organic as well. I love going to like thrift stores and like antiquing and stuff. Where do you source your materials? I'm sure you would find lots of exciting kinds of furniture pieces and wallpaper and things like that from stores like that.
I'm better at shopping for my work than I am for my house. For sure. So I do go to a lot of surplus places and secondhand stores. I like, you know, the aesthetic that I work with is kind of a bygone design era. So a lot of this stuff is cast off in these places, but I also, people give me a lot of things too. I have one piece that I made that's cut china, and it's someone's entire wedding china that they just didn't have anywhere to put anymore, so they gave it to me. So sometimes, you know, even I have even some wallpaper that people give me, or like the piece made out of my own wallpaper. I kind of just keep scraps of things, and I keep things. So it just kind of is, it's similar to the way I work. It's just like if I see something, I'll grab it and maybe make plans later. Sometimes I'm hunting specifically for a color scheme. Like for the piece that's in Paper Roots, I wanted a grayscale in there. So I was hunting specifically for wallpaper with gray. And this was actually a pattern I didn't use in there. So I had this left over. So.
Yeah, and how long does it take you to separate the patterns from the wallpaper? And how long does it take you to create a piece from start to finish overall?
Sometimes years. Sometimes a piece will evolve. Like Keeping Up Appearances, every time I showed it in a new place, I was adding to it and changing it, and then it was glued down and became Let Him Speak First. And that was like 10 years of coming in and out of a work. If I'm teaching, it takes a really long time because I just kind of fit it in between when I'm not planning or doing a lesson. But if I'm not teaching, like this piece behind me took me about 2 months, start to finish. Other works, like a lot of the installations take a year or two to make. So it depends on the scale I'm working with and how much set dressing I have to do as well.
Yeah, and your works really have an ongoing life, because the work that is in Paper Roots had a different appearance entirely at a venue before it. So are you thinking that it might change again after being exhibited at Paper Roots, or is this sort of your final stage?
Probably not, because once it's really glued down and mounted, it's kind of stuck that way. But the piece at the Turchin Center before, when it was in the Turchin Center before, it was more modular, so I could kind of change it around. But once it's really configured and glued down, like Let Him Speak First is never also going to change, because like I probably won't change this piece either, because it's really glued down, and like I've used all the parts. Once all the parts are used and it's no longer has to be flexible to be able to move around from space to space, I can kind of commit. But if I know it has to be flexible and I might want to show it as an installation, I keep things very modular. Or if sometimes I show a piece before I've used up all the pieces. So if I'm cutting a wallpaper up, I want to use every single piece that I remove. So sometimes I'll have a couple bags left over of things, but.
Yeah, you talked about wanting to leave the work a surprise, so I won't talk about it too much. But what is interesting that you went from it looking like a suspended chandelier to a really interesting wall piece, where you can kind of see it from different angles. So it's amazing that you sort of reconfigured it entirely. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and you mentioned it in this talk, but I also heard you talk about this before, that you like to insert disorder into order. And that kind of goes into a question that we have from Paulette, that how are you then approaching, how do you take that approach in today's world when so much around us is in chaos and disorder?
I'm very curious about how I'm going to reinterpret domestic space now, where it's kind of our whole world, and how, I mean, if you're privileged enough to even have that for yourself, because it does feel so much more precarious right now than it has for several years. But I think that order and chaos, a lot of that is just how life is. Like you can't keep everything super tight. I can't anyway. keep everything super tidy and controlled all the time. And I kind of mentioned in passing before the fact that I address mental illness in the work as well, and that I live with chronic pain and mental illness, and as do several other people that I have lived with or care a lot about. And so the way that that kind of feels in a space, how you can't control that always, because you don't know when another episode is coming. And so I kind of like that kind of precarious feeling in the work as well, because I'm like always kind of bracing myself for the next episode. So I feel like maybe that's even why I don't always commit to like a final orientation, because like I'm always kind of bracing for things to change and shift. So that's sort of just how I construct things naturally, I think.
Yeah, so following up on that, maybe this will be the last question. So then your practice, is art making then for you, because of all of these things that are so personal to you, is it catharsis? Is it therapy and healing? Or are you continually in search of something deeper, a deeper meaning or a deeper truth?
I think both. I naturally am fairly analytical, so I'm always kind of questioning understood truths and the way things are, and the things I read and things I listen to sort of do that as well. Just sort of break things down and try to understand the sort of systems of things. But I think I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
It seems like it's all of the above. That you are, the fact that it's constantly shifting forms and kind of evolving, it feels like you're continuously investigating something, in search of something, and at the same time it serves as a kind of way to express your whatever anxieties or feelings that you're having at the moment.
So I remembered what I was going to say now. So I get chronic migraines, and I lying in bed and feeling pain is not helpful to feel better for me. So doing something that's easy to accomplish, like cutting paper, tracing a pattern with a knife, is something that is very cathartic to me. But I think every artist will tell you that it's a labor of love, but it's labor, and you have to discipline yourself to stay on task. I have to put a block on all my distracting apps during the workday and things like that too. So, it's it is a little bit of both. So.
Yeah, we hear that a lot from artists, the artists working with paper, that not to erase the labor, because there is so much of it in there, but that repetition of labor also serves as something more, some sort of catharsis, I think, some kind of deeper resolution within oneself. And I've heard that from several artists, which is really, I think, moving and poignant. So I think with that, Liz, thank you so much. That was incredible. Always love to hear you speak about your work. This is not the first time I'm hearing you speak. I wish I was in the same space as you. But hopefully that will be possible in the fall. The exhibition is slated, I know, fingers crossed, exhibition is slated to open October 8th. We hope you can all join us to celebrate Liz's work and all of our artists' works in person. And thank you again to our Massachusetts committee, to all of our committees for your support of Women to Watch. Thanks again, Liz, for inviting us into your space today and showing us these really, really beautiful works of art that I know I can't even imagine how you do it. So thanks a lot. And Carolyn, do you have anything to add now?
Yes, I just want to kind of reiterate what Aureen said. Thank you, Elizabeth, for taking the time. I think especially in this current world, with everything going on, getting to hear from you directly is really inspirational. So thank you so much for taking the time and showing us your process and everything. It's really amazing. And we can't wait to see it in person. in person at the museum.